Multiple sources are indicating that Florida State and Clemson are chalk to the Big Ten amongst their lawsuits against the ACC right now. It would be a gigantic ripple effect felt throughout all of college football, but what would it mean for the future of the Big Ten Conference?
From LA to Piscataway, all Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
Brett McMurphy of the Action Network and College Football Insider recently made the rounds, some media rounds, and talked about where Florida State and Clemson really stand, first of all, amongst the SEC. And that's the first jumping off point that I really want to make throughout all of this. Because the SEC right now is saying thanks but no thanks to the Seminoles and to the Tigers, according to Brett McMurphy, as well as our good buddy Greg Flukar from College Football's Peek Around the Corner. He kind of coined the term chalk in terms of Florida State and Clemson and where they stand in the midst of all of this right now. If you look at the history of how the SEC expands, it's no surprise that schools like Florida State and Clemson are maybe being skipped over right now. This was once, way back in the day, a 10-team conference, the SEC was. And then they expanded with Arkansas, a new state, and South Carolina, a school in a new state. Fast forward to the late 2000s and the early 2010s. You guessed it, 2 new schools in new states. They got into the Lone Star State by adding the Aggies of Texas A&M, and they got into Missouri by adding the University of Missouri Tigers. Fast forward to this latest round of realignment. Now, they did double dip by getting the Texas Longhorns in the state, but Texas, that's the premier brand in that state, and you can understand why maybe a double dip would take place with the burnt orange and white over there. And then, yet another new school in a new state in Oklahoma. The SEC is hot after North Carolina and Virginia, those growing population centers out there in the east, to kind of complete what they have in the southeastern portion of the United States of America, which leaves open an opportunity for the Big Ten to swoop in and grab Florida State and Clemson. Those are the schools that are chalk right now, because those are the schools that have made themselves available. On this channel, we talked about Florida State and Miami as a potential pair, but Miami's lagging behind in terms of their wantingness to get out of the ACC. We know FSU and Clemson, they have already filed lawsuits. They are already in prime position if the courts rule in their favor in Florida and South Carolina to move over to the Big Ten maybe as early as 2025. But that move, what exactly would that move mean? Here at this channel, we focus on football first, and that's where I want to focus in on right off the bat. The top of the Big Ten Conference, with the additions of Florida State and Clemson, would be as good as any conference in America. And of course, when we're talking about any conference in America at the top when it comes to football, we talk about the SEC. Okay, this group of 7 is utter madness at the top of a college football conference. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Oregon, USC, Florida State, and Clemson as football brands? Yeah, it's very difficult to beat that. I know the SEC has some pretty good brands, but you look at depth of a top 7 versus a top 7, that might put the Big Ten over the edge in terms of the best college football conference in the entire country. Now, there are positives, of course, to adding the Seminoles and the Tigers. There are some possible downsides to adding Florida State and Clemson as well, and that's where I want to tackle things right now. Specifically for the teams from the ACC that would be joining. Florida State just went through the ACC this year. They went 13-0 before losing to Georgia, in that Orange Bowl. Now all of a sudden you put Florida State into the Big Ten, and FSU is playing Oregon and USC and Ohio State and Penn State and Michigan. Of course, they're not going to play all of those teams every single year, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. All of a sudden, the difficulty takes a step up where maybe some years you would expect 11-1 in the ACC, you might get 9-3 in the Big Ten Conference. Of course, the same goes for the Clemson Tigers, who would be coming over in this deal as well. The Big Ten would be utter war. It would be murderous with the amount of great college football brands and teams already in that conference. And it's not just the teams at the top that would be affected, but maybe more so, it's the teams in the middle that would be affected. With the additions of Oregon and the USCs of the world in the West Coast, the Minnesotas and the Purdues of the world are already looking up at a lot of blue bloods in that conference and say, where do we stand? Where's our chance to make it to Indianapolis now that there's no more Big Ten West? All of a sudden, they have some questions in terms of their future and what do they have to do to be able to compete? I use Minnesota as an example. As recent as 2019, pre-NIL, pre-transfer portal, we get that. But as recent as 2019, this was a team that won 11 games. Minnesota winning 11 games with those 7 brands in this conference seems very, very far-fetched. The same goes for the Purdues of the world as well. But those schools in the middle, I think, are being tugged in a couple of different directions because of the era of college football that we are about to dive into. We all know, and we're going to tackle this here a little bit later in this commentary, the value that Florida State and Clemson would bring to the Big Ten, taking them away from ESPN. And you could safely assume the financial boost that schools would get all across this conference. So although you're looking up at 2 more blue bloods for these schools in the middle, this is also some padding of that revenue that they are going to need when this thing really gets going a lot more as it pertains to rev share. So if the Minnesotas and the Purdues of the world want to try to work their way up amongst the Big Ten standings, they need more money to bring in better talent, and bringing in a Florida State and bringing in a Clemson certainly increases the revenue pot that is equally distributed amongst Big Ten schools as well. This is great for TV networks. Maybe not so great for some of these middle-tier teams in the Big Ten. And it's not just the middle-tier teams. All of a sudden, Michigan has to play a really good team in the Southeast. Ohio State just has to play one more really good team on their schedule each and every single year. There's been a lot of talk about non-conference games lately. I think you're going to see a lot more Western Michigans than Alabamas on future non-conference schedules as well. We talked about television networks, and that's where I really want to dive into next. We all know they're running the show. That's no secret. With the West Coast editions, although Fox was a big part in some of those schools coming into the conference, I believe it's CBS and it's NBC that really benefits from Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA coming in because there are no West Coast home games in the big noon slot amongst the in this new Big Ten. So CBS in the 3:30 Eastern slot, and of course the primetime slot for NBC really benefit from having some of those brands on the West Coast and can take advantage of some of those big games like the Ohio States and Oregons of the world on October 12th. How about the Penn States and the USC game that's also going to take place in 2024 as well. Now Fox, no question, they are going to benefit from having those West Coast teams, but bringing in a Florida State and bringing in a Clemson is something that you have to imagine Fox is all in on. You got to imagine that they are simping for the Seminoles and clamoring for Clemson because it adds so much more depth, so much more television ratings depth for their cash cow that is Big Noon Kickoff and Big Noon Saturday. Imagine matchups like Penn State against Florida State. Imagine matchups like Clemson against Ohio State as well. You have to imagine teams in the eastern portion of the country is a bigger advantage for Fox and Big Noon. Whether you like it or whether you don't, Big Noon is here to stay. because it's the most viewed game almost every single week on the college football calendar. As long as that continues, you're going to see Fox try to invest more and try to make Big Noon Saturday that much more of a bigger deal. When we talk about the Big Ten's future, I think one thing that in addition of Florida State and Clemson would really stick out to me with is it's shifting from the academics and the research that the Big Ten certainly valued and shifting more towards heavy into athletics and especially heavy into football. Now, we know with a rev share era, you need these types of schools, you need these types of brands to build your financial profile and bring more money into the athletic departments, not only into the schools coming in, but the existing schools within the Big Ten as well. But when we look at the Big Ten historically, AAU, those have been some of the most three significant letters when it comes to Big Ten expansion. I wonder if this signals a change in heart of the Big Ten presidents and at a lower level, the Big Ten athletic directors, because they've always been, maybe not as much as the Pac-12, but now that that conference is gone, maybe the Big Ten is the wine-drinking conference, right? They're the snooty conference, right? They're the prestigious conference, so to speak, that now exists in college football. And then you bring in two non-AAU brands. I know Florida State is really close. Clemson is certainly not a bad school academically, but now you bring in two schools from the Southeast. I'm not saying that it is a shift and it's guaranteed that that's the way things are going, but it certainly brings it into a question. So let's talk about what's next. Everybody wants to know what the end game is going to be. When is this thing going to stop? When is Florida State and Oregon going to be able to establish a rivalry over time? When is all this newness and constant movement going to stop? And this is kind of the last point I really want to hit home with all of this. Because when Florida State and Clemson come to the Big Ten, they are members number 19 and 20 of this conference. You look around at the rest of the ACC at that point, assuming North Carolina and Virginia make their way to the SEC, you look around at the rest of the Atlantic Coast Conference, and there's not a lot that gets you excited. There's not a lot that says, hey, we have to have that team. That team is going to increase our yearly payout exponentially. There's just not. So we all know about that February 2025 deadline where ESPN can basically wash their hands of the ACC at that point. If the ACC loses Florida State, Clemson, North Carolina, and Virginia, they may want to wash their hands of that deal for many different reasons, because the deal that they signed and the grant of rights that is certainly there and the amount that ESPN has to pay out to the ACC does not equal the strength of the conference without North Carolina, Virginia, Clemson, and Florida State. So there's many different reasons why they might want to renegotiate, or they just might not want anything to do with it in general. So at that point in time, the question has to be asked, does the Big 12 go shopping? Does the SEC go shopping once again? That is going to be asked at that point in time. And it's hard to imagine a future where the ACC is solidified as a power conference. And the more schools that end up leaving the ACC, it puts that conference's future in doubt. And then when that conference's future is in doubt, you have to think about the University of Notre Dame. We can't talk about Big Ten realignment without talking about Notre Dame. It's been that way for decades upon decades. So if Notre Dame doesn't have that strength of schedule and they don't have that ACC scheduling deal, what happens with Notre Dame? What happens? I think right then and there would be a prime opportunity, if the ACC does come crumbling down, or at least becomes a shell of itself, for Notre Dame to look in another direction. And of course, that's the opportunity now that the Big Ten and NBC have a relationship for Notre Dame to finally make peace, so to speak, with the Big Ten and form into a relationship with the Big Ten Conference. And we've seen them, and the Big Ten might say, hey, Notre Dame, bring somebody along with you, and we're fine, and let's make this thing happen. I think what we saw with the ACC this past summer, Notre Dame has a relationship with Stanford. We got to do something with Stanford. We can't let Stanford be out on an island. We got to get them into the ACC. Stanford has that money where they would not need to accept a full rev share right off the bat. Not saying that they wouldn't get one, but Stanford and Notre Dame seem to me right now, the way I look at the landscape, as members 21 and 22. When exactly that happens, when exactly Notre Dame is ready to make that move, that's TBD at this point in time. But that's how I see the future. Utah could still be out there down the road. Miami could still be out there down the road. But in terms of the Big Ten's future, that seems to be the path forward. I want to know what you guys think. Would you love to see Florida State and Clemson in the Big Ten? Are you opposed to it? What about Notre Dame and Stanford as a pair and the future of the Big Ten with a Southeast presence? I want to hear all your thoughts. Big Ten expansion and realignment in the comments below. I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching Big Ten Ted, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.